Welcome to the Holy Post. It's Holy Week, and an article in the New York Times argues that Palm Sunday wasn't a worship procession, it was a protest march. With that theme, Christians held peaceful protests over the weekend in both Philadelphia and San Diego to draw attention to the inhumane immigration enforcement policies of the Trump administration, including the order allowing government agents into churches during worship gatherings to arrest people. Then I talked to Senator Kirsten Gillibrand from New York about how her faith informs her politics, what lessons the Democrats have learned from their losses in 2024, and why more religious Americans view her party as particularly toxic to faith. Then Phil joins me and Kaitlyn to debrief the interview with Senator Gillibrand and discuss whether the Democrats' struggle is just messaging or something deeper. Also this week, the problem with purple. Hey Holy Posters, before we get started, a few important announcements this week. First, tickets for our next Holy Post event are now available. You can join me and journalist Tim Alberta in Detroit on Saturday, May 3rd. Tim has covered multiple campaigns and White Houses, his access to Washington insiders is legendary, and his latest book, The Kingdom, the Power, and the Glory, examined what happened to evangelicals during the last decade of MAGA. It's going to be a fantastic evening. Don't miss out. Go get your tickets today at holypost.com/events. And as always, we have loads of new stuff for Holy Post Plus. In fact, we're posting new shows, series, and resources 5 days a week, including Michael Bird's series, Between Christ and Caesar, about persecuted Christians around the world, and Esau McCauley's series, 66 Verses to Explain the Bible. This week, we also have a new batch of My Hill to Die On discussions featuring Holy Post pundits Mike Erie, Nijay Gupta, and Ryan Burge. Holy Post Plus is really where all the action is happening, so join the Holy Post media community by subscribing today at holypost.com. Here is episode 665.
Hey there, welcome back to the podcast. This is Phil Vischer. It's the Holy Post podcast. I'm here with Skye Jitani.
Hi, Phil.
Every week, your name is still Skye Jitani.
Why would it change?
I don't know. It would just be fun for variety. Could we change your name?
No.
Like Sketch Limbago or something.
Why not your name?
You had that one ready.
You can change your name anytime you want.
I just say my name is Phil. I don't give my whole name. So it doesn't need...
You're like Cher, Bono?
Yeah. Edge.
Edge. Phil. Okay.
You just need to start responding, Skye, with Phil. Hello, Phil Vischer.
Yeah.
You could do that. And Kaitlyn Chess. Hi, Kaitlyn Chess.
Hi, Phil Vischer.
Hi. Many people have complained to me, some personally offline, that the theme song needs to change to no longer say sometimes Kaitlyn.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah.
Ooh.
And that,
Thank you, people.
I don't hear the theme song when we're recording this, so it doesn't occur to me.
It's not accurate.
I know. You're right. You're right. It's just, changing music is a little harder than just, would you change the thing you say on the credits every week?
How about Kaitlyn remotely?
And Kaitlyn, but okay. Yeah. Not saying anything about that. Mm-hmm. Okay, we got big stuff going on this week. We're doing the format a little bit differently. We're going to talk shorter. Then we're going to listen to our interview. And then we're going to come back and talk more because we wanted to debrief the interview.
That's right.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
And now it's time for the theme song.
What's the news that you like the most? Who's your favorite podcast host? If it's breakfast, get your toast. It's Skye and Phil and the Holy Post. Skye and Phil and the Holy Post.
And sometimes Kaitlyn.
You know that I'm a skeptic. I like things to have evidence, proof, data. I like to research things before I commit to them. And that even goes for my supplements. I want to know that they're high quality. That's why for the last year, I've been drinking AG1. Unlike many supplement brands, AG1 conducts relentless testing to set the standard for purity and potency. I know I can trust what's in every scoop of AG1 because it's tested for 950 contaminants and banned substances, while the industry standard typically only tests for 10. AG1's ingredients are also heavily researched for efficacy and quality, and I love that every scoop also includes prebiotics, probiotics, and digestive enzymes for gut health. So, if you want to replace your multivitamins and your digestive aids, your immune support into just one simple scoop, start with AG1. Try AG1 and get a free 1-year supply of vitamin D3 and K2 and 5 free AG1 travel packs with your first subscription at drinkag1.com/holypost. That's drinkag1.com/holypost. Go check it out, and thanks to AG1 for sponsoring this episode.
Today's episode is sponsored by Sunday's Food for Dogs. We love our dog. Her name is Keena. We love to give her belly rubs, and she loves to patrol our backyard to make sure no squirrels break into our house to steal our valuables. We also love to give her Sunday's Food for Dogs. It's fresh, healthy dog food that's easy to store and serve. Most dog food is one or the other, either fresh and healthy or easy to store and serve. Because Sunday's is air-dried, it doesn't require refrigeration or prep. It comes right to our door so we never run out, and it's healthy food. Human-grade ingredients, 90% meat, 10% superfoods, 0% anything else. Folks who've switched their dogs to Sunday's notice health improvements like softer fur, fresher breath, and more energy. Keena loves Sunday's Food for Dogs, and we love that it keeps her healthy and strong so she can keep the squirrels from taking our stuff. Give it a try. Right now, you can get 40% off your first order of Sundays. Go to sundaysfordogs.com/holypost or use code HOLYPOST at checkout for 40% off your first order.
And always, Kaitlyn.
There. See, I added that. I don't know if it was in the right key, but I added it.
I think we should change it.
Yeah, I'll change it.
To reflect reality.
Reality, yeah. Okay.
Reality's overrated.
What is this reality? And every now and then, Mike Erie's here, but sometimes it's because Skye isn't here, not because Kaitlyn isn't here. So sometimes
Exactly.
We also had some weeks where you weren't here.
Yeah, but not very many. I've been gone like 6 weeks or 7 weeks in 12 years.
Really?
Yeah, seriously.
Okay.
Well, that's because we try to record around people's schedules so that we don't miss anybody.
I need a medal.
Yeah.
Where's my medal?
You get like a gold
Phil,
watch.
if you change the theme song, I'll get you a gold medal.
Okay, I have something very serious to talk about. Very, very, very serious.
I'm skeptical.
My grandkids will tell you that Papa's favorite color, and has been his favorite color all his life, is purple.
Hence the light behind your head. For
Whoa!
those who
Beautiful.
are
I'm
watching.
a glow. I'm a glow in purple. It's my radiance.
You're like Prince.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, purple rain. Here's the deal. Science tells us purple doesn't exist. Purple isn't real, science says. Your brain is just making it up.
What does
There
that
is
mean?
no such thing as purple.
But this does not apply to other colors.
Yes, you are correct. The human eye. Okay, stick with me. Are you with me, Kaitlyn? I know you look
We'll see.
intrigued. You look intrigued, or you're just relieved that this has nothing to do with people's backsides.
I am.
The human eye does not see purple because purple is not a color in the visual spectrum. Purple is a combination of red and blue.
But that's true
I
of
knew
all
that.
secondary colors. Orange is a combination of red and yellow.
But they're next to each other, so it shows up in a rainbow. Purple does not show up in a rainbow. If you put white light through a spectrum, there is no purple.
What about violet?
Yeah, good question. But wait, what about violet? The story says, well, despite what you may have come to believe, violet is not purple. In fact, violet, along with the rest of the colors in a naturally occurring rainbow, has something purple doesn't have, its own wavelength of light. Violet is what happens past blue.
Right.
But it's not going back to red because red is at the other end of the spectrum.
Oh.
Red is at the beginning of the spectrum. Infrared, ultraviolet is at the other end of the spectrum.
Yeah.
They never meet. So there's nothing if you look at light through a prism and you go through it, you will never find purple because red and blue never meet.
Okay, but that doesn't mean purple doesn't exist.
Oh, it does.
How do we see it?
Red and blue wavelengths are two opposite extremes on the spectrum. When you see both of these wavelengths in the same place, Your eyes and brain don't know what to do with them, so they compensate, and the clashing wavelengths register as a color we call purple, which doesn't actually exist.
But it does.
No!
Sounds like a conspiracy theory.
But wait a minute. Back to that statement. When there's red wavelength and blue wavelength in the same
place.
space,
Yeah, on the same
your
object.
eye is seeing both red and blue, and it mixes them, which is what...
No.
I'm saying your eye, your brain, whatever,
mixes. Does not mix them. It just comes up with something.
Yeah, it's like pixels. If pixels are small enough, your eye blends them together and you see the image.
Maybe. Here's the problem. The problem with purple. Oh, wait, here we go. Sorry, this is interesting. I got to back up even more. Cone cells in your eyes come in 3 flavors. Strawberry, vanilla, and chocolate. No. Short wavelength cones, S. Medium wavelength cones, M. Long wavelength cones, L. 60% of cones are L cones that best absorb reddish wavelengths. 30% are M cones that best absorb greenish wavelengths. And 10% are S cones that best absorb bluish wavelengths. THS is NGTHS. That's a challenge. Someone do a study on that. I don't think that exists. All 3 types of cones can absorb numerous wavelengths close to their peak, though the absorption gets weaker the farther you stray from the peak absorption wavelength. Cones do not actually see colors themselves, but they send electrical signals based on the wavelengths they absorb through the optic nerve to the part of the brain called the thalamus, where the signals are processed. Once they're parsed, they're sent to the visual cortex, which makes sense of how many cones were activated by a wavelength of light and the strength of the signal from each cone. The brain then determines what color you're looking at by comparing the differences in signal strength between the 3 kinds of cones, allowing us to see up to 1 million distinct shades. When you look at in-between colors like teal, your brain averages out how many cones of which type responded to the detection. The problem with purple is that it isn't supposed to be possible to create a color from wavelengths on opposite ends of the spectrum. The shortest wavelength detection made by your S cones, violet light, has no overlap with the longest wavelength made by your L cones, red light. To compensate, the brain bends the spectrum into a circle, making the 2 extremes meet at purple. It's an illusion of physics and neuroscience that makes us think we're seeing a non-spectral color, a color that isn't on the spectrum. Whoa. Did you know that? I didn't know that. And I'm freaking out now because purple's my favorite color. And it doesn't exist.
I don't know why I'm not excited
But in our
about
brains,
this.
it does.
Boy.
And this doesn't apply to any other color. There's no other color that's not on the spectrum that our brain manipulates.
This is from Popular Mechanics. Popular Mechanics, they know what they're talking about. They've been talking about flying cars since the 1930s. They know what they're talking about. It doesn't say there's any other non-spectral color.
Okay, so is there any application of this knowledge? Any reason why we need to know this?
It's fun at parties, dinner parties. You say,
I will tell people.
You know, purple. Yeah, see, Kaitlyn is into this.
So
Kaitlyn is into this.
I love this.
There's no purple, and it's the royal color. It's like it's royal.
This is
it's
shocking.
It has
There are
religious
theological implications.
I know.
So Alice Walker was wrong. There is no color purple.
Okay.
We're not going to take it in that direction. That's not a happy, positive, uplifting direction, Skye. We're going to take it in the direction of, isn't it interesting that royalty is associated with a color that is non-spectral?
Because royalty is an illusion that our brain
royalty
makes up.
True.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that's interesting. I didn't think about it that way.
Well, okay, wait a minute though.
What
is that?
What?
One of the reasons why purple was associated with royalty is because it was a very expensive and rare dye that was not easily acquired in the ancient world.
Yeah, so you didn't see it very often.
Right. So is that...
Because technically you couldn't see it at all.
Well, but is that... I'm taking this places I'm unaware. Like, the fact that this color is so rare in nature, is that part of the reason?
I don't know.
It just doesn't occur.
Well, but, there's... What?
This is a Lenten story.
Tell me more.
Because
Good
purple,
job,
the
Phil.
calendar.
Purple is the color for Lent, and we're in Lent. and we're talking about purple.
Look
Good
at me.
job.
Lent
at
doesn't
me.
exist.
I need 2 gold medals. 2 gold medals.
I'll make you 2.
I don't remember what the first one was for, but the second one was for
it's when
time.
you change the theme song
for
me.
One when I changed the theme song, and one because I tied in a story to Lent without realizing it.
I don't quite get what violet is if it's not purple.
It's just a longer wavelength.
Of blue.
But
it looks purple.
It's a longer wavelength. It looks warmer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So are we splitting hairs here between purple and violet?
No, purple is 50% red, 50% blue. Those two aren't next to each other. It's a non.
And so
do we have to go over
violet
this
has
all
no
over
red
again?
in it. Is that what you're telling me?
No, I don't understand that. No.
Well,
it's not mixing with red because it can't, because red isn't nowhere near it. So it can't be mixing with red.
Yeah, but I'm just saying, if blue mixed with red looks the same as violet, yeah, I understand you're getting it a different way. But if it looks the same as violet, then it's not.
It's not, though. If you pull it up. What's the difference? Because I did this earlier today. America, this is very important, and the world. I did this earlier today. I said, what's the difference between purple and violet?
Violet is a spectral color, meaning it's a single specific wavelength of light in the visible spectrum. Purple, on the other hand, is a mix of red and blue light, making it a composite color.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, fine. Difference between purple and
Skye, I think what we are discovering is that
I've stumped Skye. He can't get past
he
this.
doesn't get it.
I get it. I just don't like it.
He's not going to be able to move on.
No, look at this. Look at this. So this is purple. This is violet.
Yeah, completely different.
I guess, but not completely.
No, I know. I agree.
Chastened.
It's confusing.
I want it.
I chastened Skye.
I'm looking at the spectrum of visible light, and when you get past the blue into the violet,
it looks purpley.
It looks very purple.
Yeah, but that's not purple. That's violet.
I think this is more a question of language than wavelength.
It's about the science.
No, because purple is the color you get if you take red pigment and blue pigment and mix them 50-50.
Mm-hmm.
And that color does not exist on the spectrum.
Yes, but it exists.
Ex-pastor
the pigment
Skye
exists.
questions science.
You can mix those lights.
The color of purple exists. The fact that it does not exist, it's not a spectral color.
It's non-spectral.
Right.
Okay.
Like I can take green and red.
You're really not going to let this go, are you?
No, but seriously, you can take green and red, which are not adjacent on the spectrum, and mix them, and you get a color out of that.
You get mud.
Yeah, it looks like
what you get because it doesn't work.
But it's a color. And that color is on the spectrum, is it not?
No, brown.
Skye sounds
There's
like
no
a toddler arguing about his bedtime.
I respect a toddler that can put up a good argument. I do.
I'm going to move on. I don't know. Kaitlyn, do you think we should move on, or should we continue to humor Skye? Some people have asked, so in these trying times, what can Christians do? What are Christians doing to speak up, to advocate, to show that they care about their neighbors? Well, a Pennsylvania faith group has built an altar at ICE offices in protest of immigration arrests. Clergy representing over 30 Pennsylvania religious groups rallied outside of Philadelphia's U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement Office against President Donald Trump's order allowing immigration arrests at houses of worship. To make their point, the clergy built an interfaith altar at ICE's doorstep and offered to break bread with ICE agents, appealing to their shared humanity. The group said on social media, as Trump attempts to take away every safe space, we as the faith community stand in our moral authority to confront injustice, reclaim our sacred spaces, and lift up the power of transformative love everywhere, even to the ICE office and ICE agents. Okay, so that's one thing that people can do. The altar itself was presented by the Sisters of St. Joseph's Philadelphia Parish. Okay, story 2. What can Christians do? What are they doing?
Set up altars in front of ICE offices?
Yeah, and sacrifice goats.
Okay.
Different altar, different kind of altar. Mm-hmm. Sorry, that was more Old Testament. In San Diego on Saturday, the Catholic Church called for a large march, and a gazillion people showed up and marched on Saturday in support of immigrants. And they marched because it was the Saturday before Palm Sunday. I almost said Psalm Sunday, but that's the book, not the branch. Book, not branch. Palm Sunday, they marched with palm leaves and crosses. And the crowd was so large to support immigrants called by the Catholic Church that the parade filled 3 city blocks. That happened on Saturday.
Okay.
So people are getting involved.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
Isn't that encouraging?
Good. Yes.
I hope so.
Skye.
No, I mean, I'd love to see.
Come on,
Because
man.
I think it would encourage a normal human. Yes.
No.
But purple. Let's talk about purple.
No. No, it is encouraging. I hope it creates actual change in policy.
Yeah, but it doesn't only matter if it accomplishes something.
I agree.
Skye Jitani.
I don't know if I've said this on the podcast before. I think I've made a few vague references to people at my church and some other people in some churches in Durham advocating for immigrants in our community. I think maybe I got the most explicit about it at a HOLYPOST live event that we did in Philadelphia. But there are people in my community who are showing up to predominantly Hispanic, Spanish-speaking churches where people are not coming to church because they're worried that ICE will do a raid on the church when it shouldn't be that way. It should be a sanctuary for them. And people are coming and either just volunteering to be present in solidarity with those folks or getting trained to record encounters with ICE on a phone or something like that, or getting trained to be like legal advocates for them. They're not lawyers. They're not officially trained to represent them or anything, but they can learn more about how the process often works for people who are being detained in order to just be someone that can show up and know the right words to say or the forms to fill out. And so there are Christians that are also doing more practical things. But to Phil's point, I do think what we need in this country is both a combination of really practical efforts and Christians refusing to cede the moral authority of Christianity to those who are using it for unjust ends. I think sometimes we just go, oh, this is what Christians believe is all this bad stuff. Even we, I think, can fall into doing that on the podcast. Like Christians supported this leader. Christians believe these things. And I think it's important that a bunch of Christians are saying, no, it's just some of them. It's not what Christianity believes universally.
I do wish there was some consistency, though, because we all remember during the pandemic, there were Christians who were really, really upset at the federal government and local authorities for saying you shouldn't gather for worship because it could be what they call them, a mass spreader.
Yeah.
A super
spreader.
Super spreader kind of thing.
That's my favorite superhero.
And a lot of
just sneezes on everyone. That's his superpower.
A lot of Christians were like, no, this is the government overstepping its bounds. They can't tell us not to gather for worship. It's our First Amendment rights, on and on and on. Agree or disagree with that? The people who were upset then, you think would be upset with the federal government saying, we can send agents into a church or filter who's coming in and out.
To pull people out
and arrest them.
Yeah.
And it doesn't seem like it's the same group of people upset with one thing and the other. I think it's consistent to say, I don't like any of that. I don't want my government telling me when I can worship, how I can worship, if I can worship, or who's allowed in my worship.
Yeah.
That would be a consistent position to hold. It doesn't seem like that's happening.
Yeah,
right now.
well, and the same people that are protesting ICE pulling people out of worship services were probably not protesting needing to wear masks when they gathered.
Perhaps not.
Yeah,
No.
because we've kind of, many of these protests are led by Catholic bishops and diocese, and they have a more, as we've talked many times, more of a consistent social, what do we call it? Social theory.
Yeah.
In Catholicism. And they also aren't, particularly at the leadership level, aren't as likely to get swayed by the currents of politics.
Yeah.
And, off we go to the right.
There was one other thing in the article about the San Diego protests. Apparently the crowds were chanting amnesty yes, deportations no. And this is where I think we got to be a little bit more careful because as we've talked about many times on this show, like the border is a disaster. It is not, there is a need for greater security at the border. The amnesty policies, the asylum policies of the country, I think need to be reformed and the procedures. People are being hurt by the brokenness of our immigration system. So this argument that just blanket amnesty or I don't know if they were saying this, but open borders, I'm not sure that's a solution either.
Right.
You interviewed Breeze, what's her last name about this recently, Kaitlyn?
Censored.
Yes. And I thought she put it really, really well. Like there's a legitimate concern about our immigration policies in this country that should be addressed. And we can disagree with the way this administration is addressing them, but it's not like all or nothing. It isn't just amnesty and open borders or deportation and no due process.
Well,
there is a humane way to deal with this problem.
That's the same issue I have on social media when I say, hey, we shouldn't be treating immigrants this way. And people say, oh, so you're for open borders.
Right.
It's like, those are the only choices.
Exactly.
You're either everyone gets an abortion for free or no one gets an abortion no matter what. Like, no, those aren't the only two choices.
Right.
Gosh darn it. So if you want to help, again, I'll say this again, go to worldrelief.org/advocate. And there's a whole bunch of different ways that you can advocate for refugees, for foreign assistance, for legal protections for Afghans and Ukrainians and Venezuelans, for reinstating PEPFAR. They tell you how to do it. So do it. Okay, last thing, Palm Sunday. And then we got to go to our interview because we're going to come back afterwards and talk about it. Mm-hmm. We're going to break up into small groups is what we're going to do. And we got some discussion questions and we're going to discuss it. I'm suggesting we have a small group of about 3 here.
That works.
In the studio. Yeah.
Fun.
Mike has to stay silent.
Mike cannot.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Mike cannot speak.
I'll talk to you, Mike.
Thanks, Kaitlyn.
This piece just appeared in the New York Times. Who wrote it? Skye, who wrote it?
It's a guest essay.
Who wrote it? It's
by Andrew Thayer.
Who is whom? Whom he?
He's an Episcopal priest.
Oh, okay. Okay. Says Palm Sunday was a protest, not a procession. Okay.
He's talking about the actual Palm Sunday,
the first,
not the one in San Diego.
The first. He talks about the entrance of Jesus on Palm Sunday into Jerusalem. And he says on that first Palm Sunday, there was also another procession entering Jerusalem. It was Pontius Pilate entering from the west, as he did every year at Passover, riding a war horse and flanked by armed soldiers to reinforce law and order, the role of Caesar, that Caesar was not just an emperor, he was deified and called the Son of God, and just letting the Jews know where they stood in the hierarchy of empire. So Andrew's argument is that Jesus entered the city not on a war horse, but on a donkey with no battalions, but with beggars. His procession should be seen as a parody of imperial power, a deliberate mockery of Roman spectacle, and a prophetic enactment of a kingdom built not on violence, but on justice. Okay. Any issues so far?
Well, I don't think we should overlook the fact that that might be what Jesus intended, but when you look at what the people were doing, the palm branches, all of that the people had a very different perception of Jesus and what they were protesting.
Yeah. The people did not consider themselves taking part in a mockery of Roman spectacle.
No, they were calling for Jesus to overthrow the Romans violently, and the palms using
the means of Rome, not just opposing the content of Rome's rule.
Those palm branches had a long, significant history of symbolism in Judea, because of the Maccabean revolt that had happened earlier, which was a violent overthrow of pagan occupiers. And by waving those palm branches, they were saying, Jesus, will you come in like Judas Maccabee did and throw out the Romans violently?
Right. Then Mr. Thayer turns it to us. Have you ever done that in writing where you talk about something in the Bible and then you try to apply it?
Pretty much daily.
Wow.
Yes.
Daily?
Yeah.
Huh. With God?
With God daily.
Oh, wow. He says, we too live in the shadow of empire. Our economy prioritizes the 1% and puts corporate profits over worker dignity. Our laws enforce inequality in the criminal justice system, education, and healthcare. Our military-industrial complex would be the envy of Rome. We extract, exploit, incarcerate, and we call it law and order. And just like in Jesus' day, political leaders defend this arrangement while religious leaders bless it. And then he says specifically, since the 1980s, movements like the Moral Majority and more recently the New Apostolic Reformation have not challenged the empire, but rather sought to commandeer it. Hey, let's make that our empire. If we were driving that bus, think of the good we could do.
And all the bodies that would be under it.
If I was Caesar, if I had the ring of power, think of the good I could do it. And he says, at some point, we have to make a choice about the Jesus we claim to follow. Either he didn't care about the poor, the marginalized, and the oppressed, in which case we built our religion on a hollow figure, or he did care deeply, and we've chosen to ignore that part because it challenges our comfort, our politics, and our priorities. Well, that's a little pointed. He's trying to make me uncomfortable, and I don't like it. What thoughts, Skye? Agree, disagree? Would you shape it differently?
I would have shaped it a little differently, but in overall, his overall argument, I agree with.
Which is, summarize.
Which is when we don't want to replace Rome with the kingdom of God, we just want to replace Caesar with our Caesar. Mm-hmm. That's where we get in trouble. We remake Jesus in Caesar's image.
Right.
And that's what the people were trying to do on Palm Sunday as he entered. And Jesus, the reason he gets on the donkey was to rebuke his own people. And they're shouting, "Save us." They're waving the palm branches. They want a political revolution. They want a violent overthrow of their Roman occupiers. And Jesus basically says to them, "That's not who I'm going to be." And we still want that. We want our Caesar.
Right.
Instead of their Caesar,
right.
And we remake Jesus in that image, and that's always a dangerous thing to do.
And that's part of like being, if you're really, really upset about how things are changing or have changed, it feels like you need someone with power to put it all back, to straighten things out, to keep people in their lanes. And it seems like that's a big focus of, as we've talked about, that using the Bible for law and order, or using the Bible for grace, or using it for something healthy that takes both into consideration.
Yeah, but I don't want to say Jesus doesn't have power. It's just how he exercises it is very different than the way empire does. So he does overthrow the Romans. He does overthrow the powers of this world, but he overthrows them by dying on the cross and exposing them and rising.
Yeah, it just makes a lousy action movie. Kaitlyn.
I was going to say, one of my just beefs with a lot of Palm Sunday sermons is that they do what he doesn't quite do in this piece. He gets a little close to it, but avoids it, especially by the very end. But I worry sometimes that we give these sermons that are rhetorically really powerful, that contrast not just the way of empire, the way of the Roman Empire in particular, but to Skye's point, the expectations the people had of Jesus. Sometimes I think we contrast all of that too strongly with what he actually did, as if they wanted him to overthrow the Roman Empire, to be this victorious king. Actually, he died on the cross. And it's and in dying on the cross, he overthrows the Roman Empire and is a victorious king. And there is a paradox there that is hard for us to grapple with. I just did an episode of Curiously Kaitlyn with Dr. Joshua Jipp, where he's talking about why we call Good Friday good. And he's saying there's this tension even in the book of Revelation of he is this conquering king. And also he becomes the conquering king, where when John writing the Revelation looks and it's a slain lamb. And it's there's this paradox that we can't let go of either end. And sometimes too simplistically, I think we want to say they had these expectations of him and they were wrong. They were incomplete expectations. They were wrong in some ways, but in some ways they were completely right. And I think sometimes we fall into one of two ditches. Either we fall into, as you all have just described, we want Jesus to be like Caesar. But more than what we want Jesus to be, we want to be like that. Right. If Jesus is like that, then we can be like that. If Jesus responds to fire with fire, if Jesus responds to coercion and force with coercion and force, that means we're justified in doing that, which isn't even true, right? So much of scripture is saying God does things, and because God is the one doing them, you don't get to do them. You will do them wrongly, God will do them rightly. So he is actually victorious over these armies. He actually does overthrow the empire. That's not your job. You're not supposed to do that. But that's the one ditch we can fall into, is he uses Rome's methods. He is a king like all human kings, and we get to be that way too. But the other ditch we can fall into is he's a gentle, mild, meek teacher who doesn't really want to overthrow the Roman Empire. If he does, it's in a sort of symbolic way that when the Roman Empire is met with his sheer goodness and kindness, it just has to execute him. And it's well, no, he really does want to overthrow some things. He really does want to has and exerts total authority over his creation. And that doesn't mean we have that authority, but it does mean as image bearers and followers of Christ, we should be seeking to change things in this world, to confront some things that are evil, to exert some real authority that humans were intended to have. It doesn't mean you go to the other ditch, but both of these get us into problems where either we're acting like we should be the ones coercing and ruling and reigning in really, dominating ways, or we should just take our hands off and just kind of go, there's nothing really we're supposed to be meek and mild teachers too, who have nice comments to make, but don't really want to see anything change. Neither of those is good.
Can I just say that I think following Jesus is a little bit like bowling. You're trying to aim for him, but you always end up in one of the gutters.
You got to put the bumpers up.
Yeah, I need bumpers.
The bumpers.
The bumpers of the Holy Spirit.
Yeah.
That's what I need. You were going to say?
Oh, no. I think it's a great metaphor, Phil. Bowling for Jesus.
Bowling for Jesus.
Yeah.
Bowling with Jesus. which
Bowling with Jesus, Skye.
which is different if you're a Coen Brothers fan.
I don't get that.
You lost me there.
Don't get that? What's the movie with the dude?
Oh.
What is the movie with the dude?
Yeah, the dude abides.
Yeah. They're bowling.
Yeah.
And their big arch rival is played by John Turturro, and his name is Jesus.
I don't remember.
And they're bowling against Jesus. It's very...
Don't want to bowl against Jesus.
No, you don't want to bowl against Jesus. Your arm's too short to bowl with Jesus. Okay, we have a guest.
Yeah, we should introduce this a little bit before we get into it. So,
sure.
I don't know how long ago, a couple weeks ago, we were contacted by the office for Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, who's the Democratic senator from New York, asking, she wanted to come on our show. And we were all like, that's weird.
Oh.
Okay. And we got more information. Turns out that she wanted to come on our show, and we had free reign to talk to her about whatever we wanted. They didn't say you have to stick on these talking points or only these issues or questions. So I talked to her, appreciated her time, and I thought it'd be good for us to hear some of her answers and then come back and talk about it, because my primary interest was trying to figure out what is she thinking and what is the Democratic Party thinking about its place in the wilderness right now, because it's really out of power, and especially how are they thinking about re-engaging people of faith that seem to be fleeing from that party more than ever, including African Americans. So just so you know, as you listen to this interview, that was the circumstances behind her being on. We did not ask her to come on. She asked us, and we had free reign to talk about whatever we wanted.
Okay. All right. Here, listen to it, and we'll be right back to discuss amongst ourselves. This episode is brought to you by Public Good Generation, a summer civics program for high school students from the Center for Christianity and Public Life. It's important that the next generation views politics as a place for service and for loving their neighbors. Public Good Generation gives high school students space to ask big questions and the tools to lead with faith, courage, and conviction. This one-week immersive program takes place July 6th through 11th, 2025 in Washington, D.C., designed for incoming juniors, seniors, and 2025 high school grads. Students participate in mock town halls and mentoring sessions with Christian leaders in government, advocacy, and journalism. Take evening tours of D.C. monuments, connect with like-minded peers, and reflect on what spiritual formation has to do with our politics. Need-based scholarships are available, so cost doesn't have to be a barrier. If you know a high school student who's ready to grow in faith and public purpose, send them to www.ccpubliclife.org/high school and encourage them to apply by Friday, April 25th, 2025. This episode of The Holy Post is sponsored in part by our friends at World Relief, the Christian humanitarian organization we trust to tackle the world's greatest challenges. Right now, they're helping refugees rebuild their lives here in the U.S., while also providing aid to people who've been uprooted from their homes by the recent earthquake in Myanmar, and so much more. As you may have heard on this show, shifting policies and major funding cuts following recent executive orders have put their work at risk. But you can help. Right now, head to worldrelief.org/stand and join The Path, World Relief's monthly giving community. Your gift of $50 a month provides critical aid like food, water, and shelter when and where it's most needed. Will you turn your compassion into action? Become a monthly partner today and walk alongside families in crisis. Visit worldrelief.org/stand. That's worldrelief.org/stand.
Senator Gillibrand, welcome to the Holy Post.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be on your show.
I appreciate your time. I want to begin by talking about your involvement over the years with a bipartisan Bible study, and you have also been co-chair of the National Prayer Breakfast. A lot of people in these divided times don't realize that a lot of our representatives and senators in Congress actually are involved in bipartisan Bible studies.
Yeah.
Why doesn't what appears to be some collegiality, friendship, even interfaith cooperation in the Senate not often get displayed or translated into the public space or certainly in front of cameras? What's the disconnect there, you think, in our politics?
I think the disconnect isn't in politics. It's in the ecosystem of media. Media, particularly online media, is dictated by how many clicks you get, how many likes you get, how much engagement you get. And I think most social media runs on division and runs on extremes. And so they'll have much more conversation or there'll be more augmentation of arguments and fights, or, an exchange between two members of Congress over how they look, than the bipartisan agreement that I'm putting together with Bill Cassidy or Ted Cruz or James Langford. And when we pass good bipartisan legislation, nobody wants to talk about it. They want to talk about the days when everything collapses and nothing gets done. So it's really a challenge with media, first of all. And then second of all, it's a challenge of being able to convey to people that we are working really hard together every day to do good, common sense, bipartisan things. And every bill I've ever passed is bipartisan. Anytime I write a piece of legislation, I have a strong Republican helping me from the beginning. And again, that's just not a story that our media tells very often. So it's not really the politics, because the politics is really not involved. We agree on a lot of things. We agree on a lot of economic things. We agree on a lot of national security things. And we, time and time again, find good, thoughtful, common sense, bipartisan senators working together on pretty much every issue.
So again, to the perception issue, in the broader public, the perception is that Congress isn't passing as many bills as you used to. And there isn't as much bipartisan support. And I agree with you, there's a lot in the media that contributes to that perception. But for a long, long time, I used to go to Washington with some regularity back in the second Obama administration. And I remember hearing these stories of the Bible studies and things like that, and the friendships that existed behind the scenes. What do you attribute then to the breakdown of actual bipartisan legislation or as many bills getting done compared to in past Congresses?
I think it'll change. I think because we're in the beginning of a Congress, they're trying to get some of President Trump's agenda done, and that agenda does not rest on bipartisanship. It's sort of what he wants done now. But for example, the Senate just voted on a bill on a bipartisan basis to restore trade with Canada. And they wanted to express the view that they disagreed with President Trump, that we should not have tariffs on Canada, because particularly for northern states, it really hurt the economy. It really hurt manufacturers. It hurt farmers. It hurt ranchers. It hurt people who are buying and selling things that are important in their states. And together on a bipartisan basis, we had 60 votes to say, we do not want these tariffs from Canada. That's one example of something we've gotten done very recently. But I think there'll be a lot of opportunity. One of the areas where I'm an expert on, as well as the cryptocurrency and blockchain space, we just had a bipartisan bill get marked up in the banking committee. When that bill comes to the floor, it will pass overwhelmingly on a bipartisan basis. There's just not been a willingness to work on a bipartisan basis on things like taxes because they only need 51 votes. So in the Senate, they don't need Democrats on that vote. So they're not interested in talking to us because they can pass it on their own. But normally on other types of legislation, there is this willingness to work together, and we do get a lot of meaningful things done. In the last Congress, we passed the largest infrastructure investment ever, and it's going to build roads and bridges and sewers and ports all across the country. And that's 10 years of investment of, I think, $1 trillion in actual infrastructure. That was bipartisan. We did the energy bill and the Chips and Science Act. That bill specifically is to do advanced manufacturing of semiconductors, the kinds of chips that are in cars, the kind of chips that are in computers. And that was bipartisan. And that's over 10 years. So last Congress, we got a lot of really major pieces of legislation done, and that spending happens over the next 10 years. So the goal will be to convince President Trump, don't unwind these really thoughtful bipartisan pieces of legislation because they help people.
Your party, the Democratic Party, is sort of in the wilderness right now after the 2024 election. I want to talk about some of the reflection and introspection that's going on in your party. And religion factors into this because you've been very open and transparent about your faith, but for decades, pollsters have talked about the God gap, that those who have strong commitment to religious faith, it's a significant part of their identity, tend to favor the Republican Party rather than the Democratic Party. Back in 2019, I think when you were running for the Democratic nomination, you said in an NPR politics podcast, I don't think the Republican Party is a faith-driven party. What do you mean by that? And especially given the fact that a lot of people of faith assume that about the Democratic Party, not the Republican Party. What's the breakdown there?
It's really about how you serve. So if you are a Christian who is very centered on your faith and what you're called to do, you're called to love your neighbor as yourself. You are called to love one another, and you are called to love God with all your heart, mind, and soul. And when you look at scripture like Matthew 25, Christ asked directly, why didn't you help the stranger? Why didn't you help the hungry? Why didn't you help me in all these instances? And the scripture goes, Lord, Lord, when did we see you being a stranger? When did we see you hungry? When did we see you? And he said, what you do to the least of these, you do to me. And so when you are so anti-immigrant and so not loving your neighbor and not caring about the well-being of the most downtrodden, the most people who need food, like the food security programs to help people who don't have enough to eat, or just any of the help that we would give through government to the most at need, at risk, like Medicaid. If President Trump decides to cut Medicaid, that means he's cutting health care to the people with disabilities, to our seniors, and to our infants and children. When you cut food security to the Women and Infants program, you're making sure pregnant moms can't get the nutrition they need to have a successful delivery and a healthy baby. It just doesn't speak to our faith at all. And so I don't know the context of when I said that, but that's probably what I was talking about. It's more, what's your faith in action? It doesn't mean you don't think you're a Christian or you don't say you're a Christian. It's how do you serve your fellow man in the role you're in? And that was probably the question I was asking, but I do not know the context.
Right. But the other side of this, though, is the perception that some people have of the Democratic Party. And I know that you and many of your colleagues who hold to faith are motivated by that in much of the legislation that you're proposing and some of the policies that you stand by. But the perception out there in the broader public is that faith is not a significant factor for Democrats.
It just depends on who you're talking about.
It does depend.
A lot of our very strong faith leaders, like Reverend Warnock, he's an active pastor. Every weekend is giving sermons from the pulpit in Georgia. He is a very faith-driven person.
Exactly. But my point, I want to go back to something that...
And there's a lot of pastors in the House. Like a lot of our Black leaders from New York, from across the country are very faith-driven. Many of them are active pastors. In the prayer breakfast, a number of the people who come regularly, faith is very important to them, like Angus King and Maggie Hassan and Tim Kaine. Tim Kaine traveled as a youth with the Jesuits to do outreach and to do ministry. Same with Senator Coons from Delaware. He also is very faith-driven. He, as a young man, traveled with ministry, and I think he got his PhD or advanced degree in theology.
Right.
So there are a lot of very faith-driven Democrats.
I don't doubt that at all. In fact, I've engaged with some of them as well. And I mean, was it last week that Senator Booker gave his 25-hour filibuster speech on the Senate floor, and he referenced scripture a lot, his faith a lot. I'm not saying it's not there and it's not real. I'm talking about the perception. So back in 2006, then Senator Obama gave a really remarkable speech about the role of faith in politics. And I'd recommend our listeners Google it and look it up. It's really worth listening to. And he talked about how the Republicans have captured the ground on this religious rhetoric, and too many Democrats have ceded it. And he said that your party seems squeamish in some circles about talking religiously or using religious language or being explicit about the religious motivations behind some of your policies and legislation, because he talked about upsetting some secularists in the party on the far left, or too many Democrats saying that, well, there's a separation constitutionally between church and state, therefore we don't want to go there. But by not talking about it, you've ceded that ground to the Republicans. So that was 20 years ago. And it doesn't feel like a lot has changed. I know there are people of faith in the Democratic Party, including in the leadership of the Democratic Party, but it's just not engaged as openly, it feels like, in a lot of the party as it is on the right. except
Yeah, I think that's a fair criticism, and I personally would like to change that. It's one of the reasons.
What does that
why,
look like?
Well, I'm on your podcast,
Oh,
and
fair
so
enough.
I asked my staff, please find venues and platforms and stages I can be on to talk about faith and to talk about how faith motivates me as a public servant, as a lawmaker, and as somebody in public life. I wanted to write a book about my faith, and I've had so much trouble finding a publisher. And it's funny, I went to just secular publishers, and they said, well, we don't really see that market for that. And then I went to faith-based publishers, and they're like, well, you're a Democrat, so I don't really see a market in that. They're like, well, if you pair with Tim Scott, then maybe we could find a publisher. I was like, okay. So I go to Tim Scott and I said, well, you want to write a book with me? And he was about to run for president. So the answer was no. But like the truth is that sometimes your way isn't clear, but you can keep trying. And that's why I'm on your podcast today.
Okay. Toward that end.
It's also why in my state, when I'm there on Sunday mornings, I go and I give a small sermon at our churches all across New York City, all across the state. I just did one 2 weekends ago, and I spoke about Nebuchadnezzar and what our role is when we feel like the king is not doing the things that are right, and how as a Christian you should stand up and fight, and God will be with you in that fire. He will literally be with you in whatever trial you are given. And that is a testimony we can give to not only God, but to those who are looking at us as faith leaders.
Let's talk more about some of the reflection that's going on in your party in this season of wilderness, to use another biblical metaphor. The data shows that the most religious group in America, the group that attends the church most regularly, who reads the Bible most faithfully, who holds the most orthodox Christian doctrines, are not white evangelicals. It's not Roman Catholics. It's not Southern Baptists. It's African Americans.
Yep.
Who are also a significant part of the Democratic Party's base. And yet, even in 2024, President Trump gained some support among African Americans. So when you look at that, what does that tell you as you think about your party and its future? What does it need to do if African Americans are the most religious group in this country? They tend to be more progressive in a lot of their economic views, but more moderate or conservative in some of their social views. Is the Democratic Party at risk of not just losing more religious voters, but even some of its most faithful supporters because it's distanced itself too much from some of these ideas, values, and language?
I don't think the Democratic Party has distanced itself at all from the language or the values. I think we are a party that what we believe in fundamentally is that we believe in helping the least among us. We fundamentally believe in helping the poor with food, helping all children with education and opportunity, making sure all families have the security they need to thrive, actually caring about people in need around the globe, projecting our power through soft power to make sure people don't die of disease, of Ebola, of horrific other types of viruses. It's why we spend money around the globe. The Republican Party is becoming isolationist, like not our problem. We don't care. We don't care about the suffering in Ukraine. We don't care about a war and people dying. Democrats do. So our values are much more aligned on basic Judeo-Christian values, that we care about the least among us, and we will fight to protect them, provide for them, and help them no matter what. So love your neighbor, I see, is much more aligned with the brand of who the Democratic Party is than who the party of Trump is today.
So speaking of the brand, Rahm Emanuel, former mayor here of Chicago and President Obama's former chief of staff, he did an interview recently with Walter Isaacson, and he talked about the Democratic brand as being toxic.
I think it's because Trump redefined it in the last election through malign information and misinformation. So he used a vision of what he wanted to tell Democrats were as weak and not caring about the border and not caring about you. They care about they, them, not you. Like the most nasty, mean-spirited, divisive messages sent constantly on social media, on regular media, nonstop, in every type of ecosystem, and it's stuck because the Democrats weren't as sophisticated on how do you use these levers of communication better to spread truth. Truth and justice, honesty, righteousness. That is what we believe, and that is what we will continue to do. We are not going to copy what Trump has done and be purveyors of disinformation and malign information.
And amen. I mean, we don't, as Christians, believe in fighting fire with fire. You fight fire with water.
With truth, with truth, with love.
Right. So by no means would I advocate for that. Emmanuel went on to say, and it's not unlike what Gavin Newsom in California said recently, he was making the same economic arguments that you are, that the Democratic Party is more compassionate, more caring for the least of these, more in line with even gospel values. But he went on to say people aren't going to hear that economic message if they've already blocked you because they see some of the cultural values of the Democratic Party as being out of sync, either with the majority of Americans or out of sync with traditional values in some ways. Do you agree with that? Or do you think that's just a communication challenge that's to be overcome?
I think it's a communication challenge that should be overcome. And I think fundamentally on the social issues, we are called to treat others as we want to be treated. We are called to respect and love our fellow man, period.
Okay, but the Democratic Party, and this is true of the Republican Party too, we've seen tons of books about this in the last number of years, about the big sort and how the parties used to have a larger tent that incorporated more people, and they've both become more ideologically homogenous. We're in a new era right now, post-Roe. I know you've been a very strong advocate for abortion rights. You've also been a strong advocate for paid family leave, which is great because we know based on stats that the number one reason women cite for seeking an abortion is economic hardship, and paid family leave would alleviate that for many people. Do you think there's room in today's post-Roe Democratic Party for a pro-life candidate at any level, or is it a non-starter in the Democratic Party today?
I think anybody who wants to be pro-life can be pro-life, and that's their right. My perspective as a Christian is that I fundamentally believe in free will. And so nothing in the Bible tells you have to force your views, your values, your beliefs on people who do not share your views, values, or beliefs. And that is why I'm a strong proponent of basic civil rights, civil liberties, and bodily autonomy for all women. In the same way, I will defend their right to be religious, defend their right to live their faith, to defend their right to speak their faith. And that is consistent with the Bible. So that is why I disagree. And I disagree with the perspective of somebody who wants to impose their faith on you. I think it's against our constitutional democracy.
I'm a pluralist as well, and I believe if you have a point of view, you should be open to persuade your fellow Americans that you're right, but you also have to be prepared to lose. That's just the way our system works. But what I'm asking is, can someone hold a pro-life view, or maybe even moderate restrictions on access to abortion, and survive within the Democratic Party? Or is it all or nothing? Thinking back to the 1990s and Bill Clinton's famous statement that abortion should be safe, legal, and rare, it feels like the party has drifted from that point of view. And back in the 90s, there were still some pro-life Democrats, and that can be defined not necessarily as a nationwide ban on abortion, but advocating for some restrictions on access, and that's open for interpretation. Is that still possible in today's Democratic Party, or is it unrestricted access? Reinstate Roe is the threshold by which someone can engage in the Democratic Party today?
I think it's important that we as a party believe in bodily autonomy and equality and civil rights and civil liberties. And literally making healthcare decisions for women on any level is antithetical to that value. I think that value is a preeminent value. But if any candidate has their own view about whether they would ever seek an abortion or whether they would urge a family member to seek or not seek an abortion, that is entirely their right to have whatever beliefs they have. I would argue strongly, however, that trying to assert your beliefs on someone else is morally wrong and not consistent with certainly my faith, and it's not consistent with the Constitution.
Right. I think there's a difference between morally imposing your views on someone else and being open to persuading. That's what I'm asking. Is there room in the Democratic Party for someone to voice a view and try to persuade fellow Democrats?
And that is what our churches should be doing. Like churches who want to protect life as a sacred life, they need to be evangelizing. They need to be spreading their message. They need to be talking. That is the role of the church, to convince people that their view of these issues is the right view. But I do not think it is right for a politician to impose that view. You can certainly articulate why you feel the way you feel, but when you try to change a law to require someone to do what you do, I think that's certainly contrary to my faith and contrary to the Constitution.
Okay,
It's a constitutional problem. It would be no different than saying one class of people, and you pick your class, has to do with the other class of people, regardless. Like, it's not right. It's a moral framework that is harmful to people.
Before we wrap up, I wanted to get your take kind of on a higher altitude on where the Democratic Party is. James Carville, a couple weeks ago, was advising Democrats not to do anything. You don't have control of the Senate. You don't have control of the House. You obviously don't have the White House. Don't do anything. And his argument was essentially the incompetence of the Trump administration, which is somewhat on display right now, will lead to a self-implosion. So all the party has to do is sit back and watch this train wreck occur, and the country will be ready for adults back in the White House and in the administration and in Congress, and they will hopefully sweep the Democrats back into power in 2026. I get the political expediency of that argument, but if you really care about this country and what's going on, it doesn't feel to me that the Democratic Party should just be sitting back and watching the train wreck. What do you think the Democratic Party ought to be doing in this season proactively, both to strengthen its own messaging and values, and to protect the country from some of the perhaps more destructive impulses of this administration?
I think the most important thing anybody can be doing is speaking the truth about what's happening. Because we suffer from being manipulated by disinformation and malign influence so often, that our activists, our advocates should be lifting up the truth over and over again in multiple ways. I thought the hands-off protests were really meaningful for a lot of people. They got to march in their town, in their city, across the country. There was thousands of marches to say, I don't want President Trump attacking Social Security, hands off Social Security, hands off Medicaid. We don't want you cutting Medicaid. Our seniors, our children, our families, and individuals with disabilities need health care. Hands off our Meals on Wheels investments, hands off our Head Start, hands off our, individualized lessons plans for special needs kids at the Department of Education. Like, whatever your thing was, you were able to stand up and fight for it in a visible way. I think that is the most important thing we can do, is be visible and be able to talk about what's happening, because we don't have the ability to stop things legislatively. We don't have the House. We don't have the Senate. There's no great inflection point procedurally that's going to stop Trump. What has worked is working on a bipartisan basis. For example, when we tried to speak out about the tariffs on Canada, I think people collectively speaking out about the harm these tariffs were causing to the cost of groceries, the cost of housing, the cost of medicine was overwhelming, and it got President Trump to change his mind. So speaking out about what's happening to you and your family is the most powerful tool we have. And second, we will organize around those views and beliefs and those effects and impacts, so that we are registering people to vote, telling them that the next election is really important for them to be heard. We just had an election in Wisconsin. Overwhelmingly, Wisconsin voters were heard. It was for a state Senate race. The entire state shifted blue by multiple percentages. Even in Florida, 2 House races that were special elections shifted by 20 points towards Democrats. It wasn't enough to win because they needed to shift by 30 points, but a 20-point shift is massive. And so I think Democrats and just people who, independents and Republicans, who are unhappy with the direction of what's happening in this country, they need to organize. They need to prepare to vote on whatever opportunities are coming up. And maybe it's a year and a half. And more than anything, just speak the truth and elevate it, so we don't get drowned out with misinformation or lies or malign influence operations.
You mentioned the bipartisan effort to reverse the tariffs on Canada. My understanding is the action that the president is doing on tariffs is an emergency action of sorts, that the Congress technically, constitutionally has the power to stop that. That you could take that tariff power back from the president.
And Republicans aren't standing up. So we need them to help us. We have bipartisan legislation on that right now.
Right. Like
we're taking back tariffs. It's got multiple Republicans on it already. And so what we would need to do is convince Senator Thune to give us the vote. And if we have enough Republicans, he might. But again, when people are angry and they're showing up at Senate offices across the country and telling their senators and House members, we're not happy, this isn't working for us, this is harming my family, harming my business, making it too hard for us to feed our families, they're going to respond by saying, yeah, let's get a vote on that. Let's take that power back.
Everyone knows the Democrats can't do it alone. They don't have the votes. So but going all the way back to your bipartisan Bible studies and other friendships you have across the aisle in the Senate, do you have any hope or expectation that enough Republicans feeling the pressure from their constituents at home over these tariffs would sign on to that kind of legislation?
Definitely.
Really?
Definitely. Yeah, they already did. We already had a handful on Canada alone. Do you know, Evan, how many people are on the bipartisan take back the tariffs power are in? 7? Yeah, there's 7 on the bill already. So that's enough. And we'll get more. There'll be many more. And I think the more that these harms are being known and felt and discussed and lifted up, the more people are willing to protest and stand outside of offices and call their senator and call their House member to be heard. It has the impact of righting the ship. And I think Senator Thune, he's in my Thursday Bible study. He's one of the smartest, most faith-driven people I know. He is always going to try to do the right thing. And at some point, the right thing will be opposite to what President Trump is doing. And I believe at those moments, he will find opportunities to stand apart. And he's the leader of the Republicans. So I feel very confident that he will be there when he's needed to make sure terrible, terrible, terrible things don't happen in the future.
I'm encouraged to hear that, but I'm a little discouraged to hear that kind of mobilization is possible on the tariffs, which a lot of people will feel in the pocketbook or in their jobs. But we're not seeing that kind of mobilization on things like due process for people who are being deported, or the stripping down of USAID and the poor people around the world who are going to be impacted by those cuts. Like, we're not seeing that kind of mobilization there.
It's because it's the hierarchy of needs.
Right.
If you can't feed your kid, you care about the cost of groceries, and you don't care about another country and what you're doing to stabilize their country or protect them from Ebola or protect them from AIDS or protect them from terrorism. You just want to feed your kids. So it's a hierarchy of needs, and only people who have all their needs being met, have a safe, affordable house, have enough food to eat, have a good public school, have the health care that their family needs to survive, then they can start worrying about democracy. Then they can start worrying about the rights of others. And this is one of the hallmarks of the fact that this country has become less and less faith-driven. Like, love your neighbor does not say after you fed yourself. It says love your neighbor. It says treat your neighbor as yourself. If you have barely anything to eat, you're still going to split it with them. That sentiment is being lost in our country. We are less and less concerned about the world around us, less and less concerned about people who are seeking safety on our shores, less and less concerned about the civil rights and the civil liberties of people who aren't in their family or in their friend group. So they don't care about that student who is arrested on a college campus, who has a green card and has been sent to a country they've never been to because it's not my family. That is part of the move away from faith that we've had in our nation for the past 50 years. And that's why we need a revitalization of faith. We need a reorientation of our churches and synagogues and temples to do much more outreach, to be much more of the moment, to seek people to care about God and to care about these values before themselves. But that's missing. And that's why we're having a tough time talking about things that don't affect someone immediately, because what most voters are going to care about is their own hierarchy of needs.
I don't disagree with that. And I, in my world where I've been formed, I used to be a pastor. I think a lot of people were shaped in their personal lives, their family lives around biblical values and Christian ideals, but they were never really shaped in their public lives. That felt like a completely separate area, which is why you can have somebody go to church on Sunday and read the Sermon on the Mount and think that's great, and then say the next day, I want to vote for the person who's going to be the biggest bully in the schoolyard to treat my political enemies with contempt. There's a disconnect. And that's where I hope we have more leaders like you who will stand up in the political realm and say, faith matters here too. And it's applied differently perhaps, but it still motivates me. And if we don't hear that, except coming from on the right, it leads to a warped perception of the role of faith in these things. So echoing.
Well, I'm definitely interested in changing that dynamic. And I'm going to have a personal mission this year to change it.
Well, I hope you're successful.
And this is step one. And maybe I'll get to find a publisher for my book so I can publish all these articles and these ideas that I have.
I hope so too. I mean, I've been in that publishing world for a long time also. And, it's a lagging indicator. And the fact that they don't think there's an audience, a market for a Democratic senator with a book on faith tells you something.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? There's a lot of work to be done here. And I hope we can contribute and help do that. Not that I'm in the tank for one party or the other. I just have seen the idolatry that happens when too many people associate my faith with only one party. And I'd like to see that change.
Yeah, me too.
Senator Gillibrand, thank you so much for your time and your insights. And we will be praying for you and all of our political leaders in these trying times. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much, and God bless you.
Okay, we're back. We listened. Did you listen? We're hoping you listened and you didn't fast forward to hear what we say about it, because that's not how it's supposed to work.
All right. So I was, first of all, politicians are politicians.
Ugh. Oy vey,
they have their talking points. They have their stuff they want to get across, all that. Okay, fine. Bunch of stuff did jump out to me, though. I'd love to get your thoughts on. First off, the fact that her team contacted us and wanted to get on our show. And by the way, she's not the only senator who has reached out to us that wants to come on our show. Suddenly, there's a bunch doing that kind of thing. And I don't think it's because the HOLYPOST is some, massive juggernaut in the blogosphere.
Oh, we're huge.
We're fine.
In the blogosphere.
Whatever. But I think what's going on, she alluded to this. I asked her what she thought the problem was with the Democratic Party. Is it a messaging problem, just a messaging problem, or is there substantive position issues that they need to rethink? And she seemed to come down solidly on we just have a messaging problem. And I think that's part of the reason she and a bunch of others are trying to get on podcasts, because the big lesson they apparently got from 2024 was the Joe Rogan lesson, that Trump went on Joe Rogan and Kamala Harris did not, and they need to be out there on podcasts more than NPR. And I'm not sure that's the right lesson. I think there's more substantive problems that the party has than just getting on podcasts. So what do you think?
But if you've decided that there isn't, then you've got to say that there isn't. It really is just messaging. The first thing that jumped out to me was her saying, as a person of faith, she felt that the Democratic Party was more Christian than the Republican Party, which, how many times have you heard that said on the other side? So is that something we're both going to say about? We're all just going to say that about that I'm on the Christian side. And it's easy, and she said, we're the ones who care. We're more aligned with Judeo-Christian values. Democrats spread truth. Donald Trump spreads hate and lies. We care more about the poor. We care, so there was a pretty long list. And one of the last statements she made that I wrote down was, America has become less and less faith-driven. And she uses, the values of the Trump administration as the sign that America is becoming less and less faith-driven. And a lot of this is just like holding up a mirror to what I always heard growing up, is that America is becoming, like, both sides think it's a problem that America is becoming less and less faith-driven, but both sides think it's the other side that's making us less and less faith-driven, because we define what a faith-driven country would look like so differently. A faith-driven country is a country that would care for the poor. No, a faith-driven country is a country that would care, that wouldn't have same-sex marriage, that wouldn't have abortion, that wouldn't have pornography. So we just divide it up and then say, this is what Jesus would care about. And to a certain extent, that's what she was doing, just on the other side.
It's This is why the AND campaign is so interesting to me, because their argument is neither party has a monopoly on Christian beliefs and values. There's things that both hold to. And yeah, she was selecting them rather specifically. Kaitlyn?
Yeah, I mean, along the lines of what you were saying, Skye, earlier about just kind of messaging problem, I thought it was so interesting when you were pressing, and you referenced the Obama speech that I love too, where he's just like, if we lose the language of faith, we lose the moral language of this country. Like, we can't afford to distance ourselves from this. And it's interesting that she just sort of like lists examples of people to prove this isn't true, even though I don't think it's just a messaging problem. I think it's a much more substantive problem when it comes to faith. But what I found so interesting about that whole conversation was, she said specifically, when you asked, you kind of assumed in your question, the Democratic Party has distanced itself from the language, the stories, you listed a bunch of things. And she said, no, we haven't distanced ourselves from the language of values, and started talking about like the values that the Democratic Party held. And it's so interesting because that to me is such a good picture of the difference between how Republicans and Democrats currently are sort of using faith. They're both using faith towards political ends, but in slightly different ways. What she's doing, and what a lot of Democrats are doing, is saying we've abstracted universal values from the specifics of Christian faith. That's what Judeo-Christian often means. Is like, I've just sort of abstracted ideas that I'm going to claim have some heritage in the mishmash of Judeo-Christian, whatever that means, but I'm really kind of keeping them in a level of universal abstraction. And then I'm going to apply those to particular policy issues. So I want the values of Christianity. I don't want the specifics, the kind of awkwardness of like believing in miracles and the resurrection of Jesus. I just want the values. And what you lose with values is like, you don't have an underlying idea, like a robust idea of like, what is a human person? What makes a good human life? And that's what I think Obama was really getting at when he was listing in that 2006 speech. This is the language of MLK. This is the language of not just civil rights, but of like Catholic hospitals. And all of those come from a really robust idea of what is a human person and what makes a good human life. And I think Democrats and Republicans in different ways struggle with this in a liberal democracy where we claim everything is just choice. You should do whatever you want to do as long as you're not, infringed upon, make the choices that feel good to you. It's really hard in that context to say, like, no, actually, I do believe there's a particular idea of what a human person is and what makes a good human life. Even if I'm open to disagreeing with people about that and to having dialogue about it, it's almost taboo to even say, I have this specific idea. That's, I think, really the problem the Democrats are struggling with, is values absent any substantive story of what is a good human life is sort of meaningless. On the other end of the spectrum, you have, I was reading this morning, the Trump administration put out a statement about Holy Week. It's like a remarkably orthodox statement. Trump obviously didn't write it. Someone wrote it. It's like a good statement of like what Holy Week is. There's a lot of theology referenced in there that you could tell the person who wrote this knows what they're talking about. Yes. It was pretty significant. But what I found so infuriating about it is the idea that you can say, I believe this story and all its particulars and the miracle of the resurrection and what that... but then nothing about the value of human life and what that means for how we treat each other or the kind of community we want to live in. There's no implication there for what that actually demands of you or what that means.
Right. To speak to that directly, the statement from President Trump says, among other things, through his suffering, we have redemption. Through his death, we are forgiven of our sins. And this is the same man who said he's never asked God for forgiveness. Yeah. But he would if he did something wrong. But
he never has.
And then it goes on, this Holy Week, my administration renews its promise to defend the Christian faith in our schools, military, workplaces, hospitals, and halls of government. We will never waver in safeguarding the right to religious liberty, upholding the dignity of life, and protecting God in our public square.
I know. I love that part. I mean, that part actually makes me chuckle because you've had a couple paragraphs of Jesus defeating death.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
But we're going to protect him in the public square because he clearly can't do it on his own.
Like God has called and said, sir, is there anything you could, I'm really taking a beating over here. Is there anything you can do to help?
Okay.
But that's actually what is like so... The death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. I wanted to talk about this earlier with the New York Times tweet. The death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, you really have to believe that if you want to ask people to sacrifice a lot, especially for their vulnerable neighbors. Like in the interview when she was saying, like, how are you supposed to convince people to care about the poor around the world when they can't feed their kids? The only way that any of that makes any sense is if you believe in the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ and the resurrection that then is promised to you. So it's like one side wants to be like, yes, the resurrection, this miracle is true, but it doesn't actually demand anything of me. It doesn't actually make me, make these sacrifices or serve my neighbor in sacrificial ways. The other side wants to say, let's keep those sacrificial values, but not rooted in any story. And neither of those actually produces a Christian politics, to your point about the AND campaign.
Yeah. I think it was interesting, and then we'll move on to this other part of it, but I thought it was interesting when I was pressing her about the Democratic Party not using this language of faith very much. She cited Senator Warnock, who's a pastor in Atlanta, and she cited a bunch of other...
She immediately went to African-American Christians.
Right, and she talked about the pastors, African-American pastors who are Democrats in the House. I mean, and it's almost like, and we've heard this from even conservative Christian leaders, like, well, yeah, the black church, that's different. They can talk openly about faith and scripture.
Here's our Christians.
Right.
Bring out the black folk.
Right. Or Senator Cory Booker in his filibuster the other week. Like, they all use a lot of biblical Christian language, but that's because they're black, and that's okay. But you don't see that coming from...
Just to be clear, she did not say that.
I know she did not say that, but what's implied is, if you want to look for religion in the Democratic Party, look to our black leaders.
Who are leaving in record numbers.
Right, and that was my point, is when you look at the stats in 2024, you're losing them too. All right, let's talk about the abortion thing.
Because, no, I don't want to talk about abortion. I just want to read some of the quotes that I found interesting.
Before you do, I just want to give this caveat. I knew I had limited time with her, and I could only probably pick one social issue to highlight and illustrate, and so I chose this one because of Roe and everything. That's, for people who are like, why didn't you say this or ask about that? That was why.
Here's some quotes. As a Christian, I believe in free will. Well, I'm not opposed to that. And in a political sense, you usually hear that from libertarians who are about to make an argument against government doing much of anything.
Right.
So it's a little unusual to hear the free will argument from a progressive Democrat. As a Christian, I believe in free will. We can't morally impose our views on others. Nothing in the Bible tells you can force your views, values, and beliefs on people who do not share your views, values, or beliefs. Trying to assert your beliefs on someone else is morally wrong. It is wrong to change a law to require people to do what you do.
Yeah.
Like, what do you
Isn't
think
that
laws...
what law is?
What do you
That is what law is.
laws do?
They assert things. And
I just had to stop and rewind and say, okay, wait, okay, okay, and it's all because you're talking about a woman's right to choose.
Yeah, and I didn't want to. That thought occurred to me when she said it, but I didn't want to go there. What I wanted to get to was, there was a time when pro-life people were also Democrats.
Yeah,
and is there room in that party for people who have different views on abortion? Everything from total no restrictions to total ban to everything in between of different restrictions and policy, whatever. I just like, is there room for this conversation in the Democratic Party?
The vast majority of Americans believe there should be some restriction on abortion access, and it is higher for African Americans, which are a huge block of the Democratic Party.
And it's similar to, like, the vast majority of Americans believe there should be common sense gun rights limitations. And the Republican Party doesn't really entertain that. So why are certain things allowed to be debated in a party and other things are not? And it seems like the Democrats are stuck in this mode of, you cannot talk about abortion in any way other than no restrictions. And that's not where most of America is. And I thought, I know why she had to say that, because of her history and advocacy for abortion rights, all that. But to simply say, I wish she had said something like, you know what, I wish we had more people in the Democratic Party who had other thoughts on this topic so that we can discuss it intelligently and represent more of the country. And she might well say, for her personally, she believes in, no restrictions, hold to that, fine. I just want to know, are you open to the conversation with colleagues who differ from you?
Yeah.
And it sounded like she was just shutting the door on that.
Kaitlyn?
Yeah, I mean, it was such a good example of what's so frustrating to me about the abortion conversation, in that we have decided this one area is just an area where we can't acknowledge that communities have to make decisions about things that affect people's ability to choose. But the just kind of incoherency of saying there shouldn't be any limitations on that, because that's so inherently wrong, when all sorts of other things we've decided, no, there are limitations on some things for communities to function well, because we believe that it's not good for humans to live this way or to act this way. That's why I keep coming back to on both the right and the left, we have struggled to articulate, yes, humans have deep differences about what makes a good human life and what kind of creatures humans are. But us limiting that out of our political conversations as if that's inherently taboo leaves us in a place where we have no ability to have good conversations about how we want our communities to function.
Yeah. I think it's ironic, too, that she's obviously a very strong advocate of reproductive choice. But I imagine if I were to ask her, she would be opposed to school choice. For various reasons.
There are some things you don't get choices about.
Yeah. And so that's the inconsistency. And the Republican Party has its own inconsistencies on various things too. But I feel like, and I've said this before on the show, part of the reason we have MAGA and part of the reason we have Trump is because the Democratic Party is not as inclusive and broad a party as it could or should be. And it has allowed some of its extremist ideas to take over in a way that's not helpful. And I'm looking for some evidence that they learned a lesson from 2024 and are going to change some of that. And I hear it from people like Rahm Emanuel, and I hear it from Gavin Newsom, although I don't entirely believe him. I hear it from some of the people not in Washington, and I was hoping to hear a little bit of that from Senator Gillibrand, and I really didn't. I'm glad that she's working with the Republicans across the aisle to come up with common sense solutions on tariffs and other things. Great. But the party, we need a healthy Democratic Party if we are ever going to get back to a healthy Republican Party.
I was happy to hear her positivity about Thune, the head of the Senate, that he's a moral guy and she thinks he wants to do the right thing and she thinks he will do the right thing when it comes down to it, if there's the support to do the right thing. So that's encouraging. And I was happy to hear her say, we work together all the time.
Right.
It doesn't always look like they work together, but I guess sometimes they work together. But the statement trying to assert your beliefs on someone else is morally wrong. It just immediately makes me think of Northern abolitionists trying to assert their beliefs on the South. And the South says, no, that's what you believe. That's not what we believe. We have this set of beliefs about human dignity and who deserves human dignity. And that has something to do with the abortion debate, which is also about human dignity and who deserves human dignity. So the notion that if my view of human dignity is different than your view of human dignity, that means that neither of us can pass a law about anything on that topic.
That's right. And the stories you cited earlier about the protests in San Diego and the altar in front of the ICE office in Philadelphia, like that's people saying, we believe immigrants of whatever their legal status are human beings that deserve dignity and due process. Yeah. I think Senator Gillibrand would agree entirely with that, and she would favor laws that require the administration to treat immigrants as human beings with human dignity. That's imposing your moral view on other people who may disagree with it because it's right. And there are people of faith and no faith who believe that abortion is the taking of human life, and they simply want to be able to make that argument and persuade their fellow citizens of it in the halls of justice and power in Congress, in the White House, in the Democratic Party, and in the Republican Party. And the fact that one party says, we will not have that conversation, I think is short-sighted and hypocritical.
Kaitlyn, wrap it up.
I mean, very simply, like all laws are expressions of moral beliefs. They all are. And we have decided, another one of the lies that we have bought into is the idea that there are some universal, abstract, come from nowhere beliefs that everyone shares. And then there are these kind of particular pet projects that certain religions or ideological factions have. And it's just not true. I mean, we've talked on the show before, lots of historians, theologians have done work on like so much of what we consider universal, just human beliefs about things are things we inherit from Christianity. Those are ideas that really deeply shaped Western political thought. It doesn't mean that we can't find areas of common ground. It doesn't mean that there are limitations on how much we are willing to say someone's conscience needs to be bound or things they need to be limited from. There are going to be areas where we say, I as a Christian believe certain things, and I don't think those should be legislated for everyone to hold. But the idea that there's legislation that is just universal, abstract moral beliefs that don't come from anywhere and shouldn't offend anyone, and then there's particular religious ideas, isn't true. That's a division that doesn't actually make any sense. What I wish we could do and how I wish she would have responded to your point earlier, Skye, of just like, we can have this conversation. Let's hash it out. What I wish we could do is say, everyone is coming from a particular perspective. They're drawing on whether it's religious ideas or like just deeply held ideas about how the world should work and what kind of creatures humans are. We're all bringing those, and we should bring them, and we should hash them out in public for the sake of our communities, for the sake of our communities being good, flourishing places. Neither party is doing that right now. And both are trying to be somewhat dishonest about where they're getting the beliefs they hold and what reasons they have for holding them.
Okay, we got to wrap it up. Thank you, Senator Gillibrand, for being on the show. We agree with you a lot. We also disagree with you some. And I hope that's okay. And thanks for listening, everybody. Have a good week. We'll see you next time. The Holy Post podcast is a production of Holy Post Media, produced by Mike Strelo, editing by Seth Gorvet. Help us create more thoughtful Christian media by subscribing to Holy Post Plus at holypost.com/plus. Also, be sure to leave a review on Apple Podcasts so more people can discover thoughtful Christian commentary, plus ukulele and occasional butt news. Visit holypost.com for show notes, news stories, Holy Post merchandise, and much, much more.